One day, you command a global empire. The next, your access is revoked, and the machinery of the building turns against you. In early 1973, Clive Davis was the undisputed architect of American music. At 40 years old, he commanded Columbia Records with absolute authority. Then came May 29th. Davis was summoned before the CBS board, fired, and walked out of the Black Rock Tower. His belongings had been packed into crates while he was in the meeting. Within days, CBS edited him out of a company film, a literal erasure of his presence from their history. This wasn't just a termination, it was an institutional silencing. A man who had dictated the direction of the industry was suddenly forced into professional exile on the orders of his criminal lawyer. The downfall originated with a narcotics investigation. The FBI had indicted a drug trafficker named Pasquale Falcone, whose records led investigators to Davis's vice president of artist relations, David Winshaw. When CBS learned of the FBI probe, they padlocked Winshaw's office and brought in internal auditors. While they were looking for evidence of narcotics or payola, the auditors turned their focus toward Davis's own expense reports. This ledger summarizes the $94,000 in personal expenses CBS used to justify his firing. The list included renovations to his Manhattan apartment, the rental of a Beverly Hills summer home, and a lavish bar mitzvah for his son. While industry peers viewed these as standard executive perks, the unproven shadow of the drug investigation left Davis legally exposed. Under his lawyer's advice, he could not publicly address the allegations, leaving him trapped in a narrative he couldn't control. The scandal revealed a fundamental vulnerability. His entire professional legacy was now at the mercy of a corporate board's interpretation of a financial audit. When a builder is removed from a system, they don't stop building. They simply construct a new mechanism from the ground up. 18 months after his firing, Davis launched Arista Records. He shifted from employee to 20% owner, naming the company after the Honor Society at Erasmus Hall High School to signal his return. He began by signing counterculture artists like Patti Smith. These were acts that the cautious corporate board at CBS likely would have rejected, but they gave Arista immediate creative credibility. He balanced this with engineered pop success, pairing artists like Barry Manilow with specific radio-ready songs. This hands-on methodology allowed him to manufacture hits rather than just waiting for them to happen. By acting as both owner and creative director, Davis eliminated the layers of corporate oversight that had once controlled him. He had built a structure where the final authority resided solely within his own office. The true test of this new machine was its ability to reverse the trajectory of artists whose commercial lives were considered over. By 1980, Aretha Franklin was struggling to find an audience. Davis brought her into the Arista system and engineered a series of comebacks that returned her to the top of the charts. This process was highly replicable. He took Dionne Warwick, whose career had stalled, and rebuilt her relevance through carefully curated hits. He did the same for Rod Stewart and Carlos Santana, proving his system could manufacture a second peak for legacy artists. By the early 80s, Davis had proven that the institution didn't make the man. He successfully built a more efficient machine on his own terms. In 1983, Davis watched a 19-year-old girl sing at a nightclub in Manhattan. Whitney Houston possessed a voice of immense technical power, and for the Arista system, she represented the perfect subject for a precise cross-genre development strategy. Davis managed every variable of her career. He merged her gospel and R&B roots with a pop crossover sound, engineering a persona that appealed to all demographics. The yield was staggering. Her debut produced 3 #1 singles, setting the stage for 200 million records sold. Houston's rise confirmed that Davis's methodology was no longer tied to a major corporation's resources. He had successfully replicated the scale of his previous empire using his own private architecture. But a system designed for relentless commercial output places immense weight on its central individual. The pressure to maintain this global, manufactured image created immense friction in Houston's personal life. While her marriage to Bobby Brown was frequently scapegoated for her descent into addiction, the root causes were far more systemic, a result of the unyielding demands of her global brand. Davis found himself in a dual role. the protective mentor who staged interventions and wrote letters, and the label boss who required the next record and the next world tour. He was both her protector and her curator. While Davis believed he was being a father figure, those close to Houston felt the commercial pressure he applied was itself the problem. What she may have actually needed was permission to stop. That permission never came. On February 11, 2012, her life ended in a public tragedy that fractured the most significant masterpiece Davis had ever built. The same rigid, controlling architecture required to survive a corporate exile and engineer a musical god is often the exact pressure that a human being cannot withstand. Janis Joplin, Bruce Springsteen, Whitney Houston, and dozens of others. Their careers all passed through the hands of a single executive. Yet this man, the ultimate gatekeeper of American popular music, could not play an instrument. In his early years, he possessed no deep interest in the records he would eventually sell by the millions. Clive Davis was a Harvard-educated lawyer. He took an in-house position at Columbia Records primarily because it offered a reliable salary. Davis approached the record business with a clinical focus on risk management. He viewed hit records as necessary safeguards against the financial instability that had defined his early life. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. At Erasmus Hall High School, he was a studious teenager, focused entirely on finding a professional path that offered long-term security. During his time at New York University, his parents suffered separate, fatal medical emergencies. They both died within a span of 11 months. At 18 years old, Davis was an orphan. He moved into his older sister's home in Queens with nothing but his academic record to rely on. That sudden loss pushed him to secure a full scholarship to Harvard Law School. He entered the corporate world looking for a permanent shield against further tragedy. The experience of losing his family permanently wired him with an acute fear of instability. He spent the next several decades building a professional fortress designed to ensure the floor would never drop out from under him again. By the early 1960s, Columbia Records offered the exact type of prestige Davis wanted. The label was highly profitable and relied on the predictable sales of classical music, jazz, and Broadway cast recordings. Davis utilized his precise, legalistic work ethic to navigate the business side of the label. By age 35, he had risen to the role of president, despite having never worked with a rock artist. However, a cultural shift was happening outside the label's walls. The counterculture of the 1960s was exploding, and Columbia's traditional catalog was beginning to look like a relic of the past. By 1967, his corporate sanctuary faced the threat of irrelevance. To protect the company's stability, Davis had to leave the safety of his office and investigate the new sounds of the street. He was sent to California to evaluate the performers at the 1967 Monterey International Pop Festival. Standing in the crowd, he watched Janis Joplin perform. He saw a raw energy that was entirely absent from Columbia's current roster. Davis realized that the industry was moving towards this new sound. To maintain Columbia's market dominance, he signed Joplin's band before the weekend was over. After seeing the massive turnout at Woodstock, he followed the same logic and signed Carlos Santana. He aggressively moved into new markets, bringing the loud, high-energy aesthetic of Aerosmith and the soulful sound of Earth, Wind & Fire into the conservative label. By 1972, he had developed enough confidence in his new direction to sign a completely unknown Bruce Springsteen. His success as a talent scout was born of cold necessity. Davis applied a lawyer's obsession with market share to the world of rock, signing artists to ensure Columbia remained the most stable house in a changing industry. Between 1967 and 1973, Columbia's rock music volume expanded from 15% to over 50%. As the catalog shifted, corporate revenues doubled, jumping from $170 million to $340 million. At the height of his power, Davis earned a salary of $350,000 a year. He lived between a Manhattan apartment and a summer home in Beverly Hills. His dominance was absolute. Newsweek eventually named him the #1 recording executive in the country. By 1973, he had seemingly achieved the impossible. He had built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and status that fully insulated him from the tragic instability of his youth. Then, on May 29, 1973, everything he had built collapsed in a single day.
One of our sources hit the nail on the head with this idea. The full story is always more interesting than the canon. The standard canon of a music executive is usually this perfectly wrapped PR package, right? Brilliant discoveries, massive hits, endless parties. But today, we're looking past those carefully curated industry myths. We're going to balance his absolutely unparalleled public triumphs with a fiercely guarded personal life that frankly remained a total mystery to the public for decades.
It's a massive paradox. For 80 years, the very man who literally shaped the public face of popular music kept his own inner world completely off limits. I mean, think about it. Here is a guy constantly at the center of the room, surrounded by flashbulbs, reporters, and the absolute biggest celebrities on Earth. He orchestrated the images of global icons, yet his own inner truth, totally locked down. The silence on his personal life was absolute, even with all the noise surrounding his career.
Publicly, he built this very traditional, picture-perfect life. Looking at the timeline, you've got 2 marriages, first to Helen Cohen in '56, then to Janet Alderberg in '65. Over those years, he built this large, tight-knit family, eventually having 4 kids and 8 grandkids, and by all accounts, he was a wonderfully open, deeply connected family man. But the rest of the world? We didn't actually learn his full truth until 2013. That wall between the family man and the public titan was completely impenetrable for basically his entire life.
Then, at 80 years old, Davis publicly comes out as bisexual in his autobiography, The Soundtrack of My Life. Just think about the gravity of that for a second. Coming out at 80, in an industry famously obsessed with youth and rigid public images, it's a massive statement. He told Katie Clark on his press tour that he simply couldn't write an honest book without sharing it. As he put it, there was an attitude toward bisexuality that you're either gay, straight, or lying. That's not true. It was this incredible, late-in-life revelation that totally shifted how we all understood him.
But just a decade before that deeply personal revelation, Davis faced a very public, very brutal professional shakeup. The year was 2000. He was 68 years old, and BMG, the corporate parent company, effectively forced him out of Arista Records. Picture that real-life corporate drama. This legendary executive, the literal architect of the company, coldly shown the door because he was supposedly past retirement age. The suits basically decided his era was over and expected him to just quietly fade into history. Well, those executives completely underestimated the fierce loyalty of his roster. I mean, the Queen of Soul herself, Aretha Franklin, went straight to the press and laid it out. If Clive leaves, I leave. When Aretha Franklin publicly draws a line in the sand like that, the power dynamic instantly flips. That very public threat gave Davis some serious, undeniable leverage against the execs trying to boot him.
And because of that intense loyalty, BMG realized they were making a catastrophic mistake. They couldn't exactly let a guy like Clive Davis walk right over to a competitor. So what did they do? They completely pivoted and financed a brand new label for him to the tune of $150 million. For an executive, they literally just tried to retire. That number is just mind-boggling. Plus, they gave him a full 50% stake in the whole shebang.
He named this massive new venture J Records. The J was actually a really heartfelt nod to his family. It stands for J, the middle initial he shared with all 4 of his kids. It's a beautiful little detail that bridges his fiercely protected private world with his very public professional rebirth. And armed with his own label and half ownership, Davis was completely ready to prove to the entire industry that his golden ear was as sharp as it ever was. His very first major swing at J Records? A 20-year-old Alicia Keys. Even looking back at clips of her earliest performances, you can see that undeniable, raw star power, and Davis spotted it instantly. Her debut album, Songs in a Minor, didn't just do well, it absolutely exploded. 10 million copies sold worldwide in year 1, 5 Grammy Awards. It kicked off an unmatched historical run of discovery that spanned 34 years, literally from Janis Joplin in '67 to Alicia Keys in 2001. That is 3.5 decades of defining the cultural zeitgeist. This unbelievable late-stage comeback didn't just silence the critics, it completely cemented his financial and professional legacy. He racked up a mountain of cultural milestones and effectively reclaimed his crown. It really was the ultimate triumphant final chapter for a guy who, remember, started out with literally nothing, yet managed to reach the absolute pinnacle of the music biz one last time, completely on his own terms. And that final chapter certainly paid off. When Davis passed away on June 22, 2026 at the age of 94, he left behind a staggering estimated net worth of $600 million.
To really grasp the weight of that number, you've got to zoom out and look at the sheer scale of his life. We're talking about an electrician's son from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, a kid who tragically lost both his parents by age 18. A man fired in absolute disgrace at age 40, who somehow had the pure grit to rebuild his empire from nothing. Not once, but twice. It's an incredible story of resilience.
But hey, as we audit this massive legacy, we really do have to remain objective. We're looking at two very real, very undeniable truths that sit side by side in music history. To get the full picture, we have to acknowledge both the incredible light and the undeniable dark of his career. Truth number one is what the industry famously calls the golden ear. Clive Davis genuinely, absolutely changed American music forever. Looking at the archival footage, he's the guy who heard Janis Joplin at Monterey and saw the future. He built the Arista dynasty from the ashes of his own disgrace. He gave Whitney Houston to the world, and he backed Alicia when others might have blinked. The sheer volume of timeless, generation-defining music he championed is brilliant. There is no denying that.
But then there's truth number two, the very real human cost of how he did business. The documented reality is that he operated with a level of control that severely impacted real people's lives. He sidelined massive talents like Phyllis Hyman. He publicly, famously disputed Kelly Clarkson's accounts of their working relationship. And, perhaps the most tragic thing on the historical record, allowing his famous pre-Grammy party to just keep going downstairs while Whitney Houston, his greatest discovery, lay dead in her room just floors above.
Both of these realities, the unmatched musical genius that shaped generations, and the undeniable collateral damage left in his wake, they're both completely documented. They both happened. You know, the industry loves to canonize its giants and smooth out the rough edges for a perfect PR narrative. But as we've seen today, the real story is always infinitely more complex than the myth, which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question to chew on. Considering the totality of his life, how exactly should we remember Clive Davis?
So here is our docket for today's investigation. We'll be looking at 5 distinct case studies. 1. The Beverly Hilton decision. 2. The Milli Vanilli deception. 3. Commercial calculation versus artistry. 4. Millions sold, nothing earned. And 5. Disputes over the record. Section 1. The Beverly Hilton decision. Let's jump right into our anchor case, which brings us to arguably the single most controversial night in legendary music executive Clive Davis's life. What's really fascinating and honestly deeply chilling about this timeline is the proximity of these events. I mean, since 1975, the night before the Grammy Awards, Clive Davis hosted a pre-Grammy gala at the Beverly Hilton. It was literally the most exclusive event in entertainment. You had billionaires, Hollywood stars, and music royalty all under one roof. So on February 11th, 2012, the event was scheduled as usual. But that afternoon, on the 4th floor of that exact same hotel, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her bathtub. Despite paramedics performing CPR, she was pronounced dead from accidental drowning at exactly 3:55 p.m. She was only 48 years old. Let's just take a brief moment to sit with the gravity of that loss. Well, despite that, just downstairs at the Beverly Hilton, preparations for Davis's massive party simply continued. The party went on. And that brings us to this quote. When the evening actually began, with celebrities and executives filling up the ballroom, Davis took the stage to address the room. He spoke with evident grief, absolutely, but he justified the continuation of the event by telling the crowd, simply put, Whitney would have wanted the music to go on, and her family asked that we carry on. And keep in mind, all of this was said while Houston's body remained on the floor just above them. Now, as you might expect, the reaction to this was immediate and fierce. It instantly split the public and the industry right down the middle. On one side, you have Davis's defenders who argued he was honoring her memory in the only way a music man really knows how, through the music. But on the flip side, critics were completely appalled. Celebrities were being photographed, laughing and dancing, just floors below a tragedy. Singer Chaka Khan actually publicly called for the entire event to have been canceled, echoing the critics who stated that Davis was choosing the party over the person. This is a charge that had kind of followed their working relationship for years. And history has not settled this ethical verdict. And honestly, as we look at the facts, it probably never will. Section 2, the Milli Vanilli deception. Let's step back in time from that tragic night in 2012 all the way back to 1989 to look at the ethical boundaries of truth when you're in the pursuit of a hit. So in 1989, Arista signed a German R&B duo named Milli Vanilli, and they produced an absolute international smash hit, even winning the Grammy for Best New Artist in 1990. But then, the duo's producer, Frank Farian, dropped a massive bombshell. He revealed that neither member of Milli Vanilli had sung a single note on their album. No way, right? Davis claimed Arista had been completely unaware of the deception. But this leaves us with a huge historical question. Did the label genuinely not know, or was the question simply never asked because the record was selling entirely too well to interrogate?
The really crucial point here is what happened to the artists once the truth actually came out. The fallout was immediate, total, and it was placed entirely on the duo. Their Grammy was historically stripped, the smash hit album was pulled from store shelves, and the duo was swiftly dropped by Arista. It's a classic case where the industry machine protected itself while the artists became the face of the scandal.
Section 3, Commercial Calculation versus Artistry. We are now moving to a highly tragic narrative to examine what happens when an artist's personal vision completely clashes with a label's demands. And this brings us to Phyllis Hyman. She was a jazz soul singer with just extraordinary gifts. Her original label was absorbed by Arista back in 1978, but as the historical record shows, Davis reportedly pushed her away from the jazz ballad direction that her own artistic instincts favored, and instead pushed her toward radio-friendly pop crossover material. This creative clash resulted in Hyman being sidelined at Arista. The label's resources and attention were instead poured into a rising new star, Whitney Houston. Hyman eventually left Arista and struggled commercially for years. This brilliantly illustrates the ethical tension of what we call commercial calculation. Basically, it's the act of prioritizing financial profitability and market trends over an artist's personal, creative integrity and their well-being. And the human toll of this calculation can be devastating. Phyllis Hyman had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Tragically, on the morning of her final concert in 1995, which was actually a sold-out show at the legendary Apollo Theater, she died by suicide in her apartment at the age of 45. When we look at the historical blame for this, we see a deep, deep divide. On one side, Hyman's devoted fan base has, for decades now, held Davis partly responsible. They argue the label totally failed to advocate for an artist who desperately needed support, claiming that choosing commercial calculation over artistic integrity ultimately cost a life. On the other side, the objective truth remains largely unknown. Davis never publicly addressed this directly. So the absolute truth of what happened in those executive meetings? Well, that belongs only to those who were in the room. Section 4. Millions sold, nothing earned. Let's transition to the purely financial side of these artists' struggles. 12 million. Let that sink in. That is the staggering number of copies sold of TLC's iconic album, Crazy Sexy Cool. By any metric in the world, moving 12 million units is a monumental, culture-defining financial success. It's astronomical. Yet in this incredibly jarring narrative contrast, in the exact same year of that massive success, TLC filed for bankruptcy. Despite generating millions upon millions of dollars in sales for their label, LaFace Records, which, by the way, was a joint venture Davis had structured, the group themselves was left with almost nothing. You gotta wonder, how is that mathematically possible? Well, it all comes down to the fine print. Let's break down their specific contract structure. Virtually every basic expense required to be a global superstar was treated as a recoupable loan. Those million-dollar music videos? A loan against their earnings. Travel and food on tour? A loan. Their styling and wardrobe? A loan. The label fronts the money, but the artist pays it back out of their cut of the record sales. TLC is really the defining case study in how the industry can legally exploit artists, allowing them to sell millions while earning absolutely nothing. Once again, we have a debate over culpability. Defenders of Clive Davis are quick to point out that LaFace was a separate, black-owned label managed by L.A. Reid and Babyface, and that Davis can't be held personally responsible for their specific contract structures. Critics, however, argue that as the distribution partner who structured the joint venture and had ultimate oversight, he was far from uninvolved. It really leaves us to weigh whether executive oversight makes you responsible for the practices of a partner label. Section 5, Disputes over the record. This brings us to our final historical dispute in the modern era, where we examine who actually gets to tell the story of music history. So, in 2013, Clive Davis published his memoir, The Soundtrack of My Life. And immediately after its release, American Idol winner Kelly Clarkson, who had worked with Davis at RCA, issued a fierce public defense.
pushing back against literally the most powerful man in her industry. She stated plainly, "I refuse to be bullied, even by Clive Davis." Clarkson was disputing Davis's recounting of their creative clashes over her album My December. Davis had opposed the album's direction, and it was widely considered a commercial disappointment. But Clarkson took major issue with the personal framing. The memoir claimed Clarkson burst into hysterical sobbing in his office. Actually, scratch that, Clarkson vehemently denied this. She called the account a violation of her lived experience and publicly accused Davis of memory lapses and misinformation. She utterly refused to let the industry executive dictate her personal history. Now, to be fair to the complete historical record here, Clarkson did later apologize publicly for some of the heat of this public dispute. However, she stood her ground on the most important fact. She never retracted her core charge. She maintained that Davis had fundamentally misrepresented what happened between them behind closed doors. And that brings us to the ultimate question of this explainer. From the chilling timeline of the Beverly Hilton while Whitney Houston lay upstairs, to the disposable nature of Milli Vanilli, the tragic sidelining of Phyllis Hyman's true artistry, the financial devastation of TLC's massive success, and Kelly Clarkson fighting to protect her own truth. When the record finally stops spinning and the executives take their bows, who truly pays the price for the soundtrack of our lives? Thank you so much for exploring these critical ethical boundaries with me today. Keep